My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the Unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. And we're joined today by Thomas Hargrove of the Murder Accountability Project. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on Mind Over Murder today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself first, your background?
Oh, goodness. I'm a retired journalist. I spent 37 glorious years as a newspaper reporter. I was an investigative reporter for many years. I'm even a former White House correspondent here in Washington, D.C. They were really, although I hated being a White House correspondent, it's a very limiting job. But my years as an investigative reporter were just glorious, and I enjoyed that. Fortunately, my company had to cut back on newspapering. In fact, my company no longer owns newspapers. And so I was retired very comfortably in 2015. And I was very happy about that because I could go on to my other great love, which was the formation of a nonprofit organization called the Murder Accountability Project. This was an outgrowth of one of our national reporting projects back when I was a reporter looking into unsolved murder. We realized that there are a great many things that are broken in America when it comes to providing homicide detectives with the tools that they should be having. And so we created, I and other volunteers, we're all totally volunteer, nobody gets paid. We created a nonprofit organization with the job of assembling what is, without debate or question, the most complete accounting of homicide available anywhere. We have assembled the most complete record of homicides, starting with data the FBI acquires in the Uniform Crime Report and the Supplemental Homicide Report. And then we contact police agencies that do not voluntarily participate in federal reporting. If necessary, we'll go to court. And we've gone twice to court to require that agencies that do not provide information to the FBI must provide information to us under the Freedom of Information Act. We take the position, Your Honor, the people of, and you fill in the blank, people of Illinois in one case, and the other, the people of the United States, have the right to know how they're being murdered and whether those murders are being solved. And we've never lost with that argument. We make the data available online in as easy a format as we can think of at murderdata.org. The information was primarily created for homicide detectives, but the general public is welcome to use the data as well.
This sounds like something the Department of Justice should be handling. Why are they not? Why has it fallen to your nonprofit?
Well, the Department of Justice does make those elements of information that they have available to them available, and we get them. The FBI is very good to us, providing the data as soon as it becomes available. They feed us often before other academic institutions get the data. They've been very, very kind to us. There is perhaps a reluctance to make case-level information available or to make clearance data available about specific agencies, perhaps over a desire not to embarrass, and that's also not our intention either, to embarrass police departments. In fact, it's our position that what we do does not embarrass police departments. If a police department has a low homicide clearance rate, our position is that's because they are not being given adequate resources to address major crimes. And we often have meetings with detectives, and we tell them to use the Uniform Crime Report as a tool, that if your murder clearance rate is low, you should go in and demand more resources, especially more people. If your murder rate is high, clearance rate is high, you should go in and demand a raise. If it's both, if it's between, it's a condition that does require more resources and probably a raise. But we argue that this is information that police departments should use to leverage more resources. Anyway, we do this because there is no master list in America, and we're trying to build one so that homicide detectives can test theories about a particular case. If they're up against the suspect and they are convinced this is not his first rodeo, they can come to our database and look up cases in agencies or jurisdictions where that guy has lived and see if there are matching cases that are unsolved.
I'm still floored, Thomas, that the Department of Justice isn't compiling these statistics. Doesn't the public have a right to know this stuff? If they know that if they live in a particular city and the homicide clearance rate, that is the solve rate, I'll speak like the civilian that I am, is low, don't they have a right to know that?
People do have a right to know what the murder clearance rate is in their community. And I guess the Justice Department does make that information available if you break down the data in such a way as to be able to present it for a particular agency. They tend to report the data more generically, what the clearance rate is by state, what the national clearance rate is. At one point, the FBI was allowing clearance rates to be calculated down to the agency level. They stopped doing that for a while, I think possibly because we were doing that. And so we could be the heavies, the folks that were showing what individual agencies are doing. It is a delicate matter. The Justice Department is not in business to cause any embarrassment, and they'd rather not.
I have to push back here. I mean, look, everyone who listens to this podcast knows that I'm the brother of a murder victim and that we're working on advancing the Colonial Parkway murders specifically and the cause of unsolved homicide victims across the country. So my perspective may be unique, but I am floored, legitimately floored, that the Department of Justice doesn't seem to feel that the American public has a right to know that, for example, it isn't just the clearance rate. I think the public has a right to know that there are hundreds or even thousands of uncleared homicides in their hometowns, and that even further, that they have a right to know that there have been serial murders in their community and that there are unsolved homicides and there may be patterns here. You're being very politic, and I'm being perhaps less so. But that's our role here, I think. I'm genuinely flummoxed that the Department of Justice and my friends at the FBI, and I think I still have a few left, are perfectly okay with sort of papering over what I think is a national scandal. Tell me I'm wrong.
That the rate at which we clear homicides has been declining over time. Yeah, that is a scandal. And our source for that is the FBI. Every year, the Criminal Justice Information Services Division of the FBI, based in West Virginia, reports their calculation, their best estimate for what the national clearance rate is. And you can see what those results are at our website by looking under analytics and then looking at charts. And you're going to see a great big chart showing an ever downward trend over time for how many murders are cleared. In the most recent year, the clearance rate was about 61%, which is much lower than in most other Western nations. And it has been declining over time. 3 years ago, we scored a brand new low. Only 59% of our homicides were solved. What that means is that there are a growing number of cities in America where most murders go unsolved. So I wouldn't be that hard on the FBI or the Justice Department because they are the source of that information. They spend our tax dollars to make those estimates. So they're hardly hiding the problem. They are the source of the problem. Perhaps they don't advertise the problem the way we do, but then again, it's not the government's job to advertise things. But we find that alarming. You find that alarming. That's why you've invited me on this show. We're hoping to provide resources, but also we're hoping the data that we present will itself become a political force, so that the general public can go to murderdata.org, look up the clearance rate for their particular city. And if they don't like what they see, and increasingly the odds are they won't, they'll have a conversation with their mayor, their city council member, their neighborhood association president. We want the data to become a political force. Again, that's something that the Justice Department doesn't necessarily want to be involved with. Politics is not supposed to be their bailiwick. We, however, want people to realize that a declining clearance rate is a failure of resources by local leadership, and that it's up to the people to demand changes. So we're free, being a nonprofit, non-government entity, we're free to make information available and to tell folk to demand change if they're not happy with what they're seeing.
Can you talk a little bit about what accounts for this declining clearance rate? What has the data shown you?
Yeah, there are a variety of factors involved. First of all, the nature of murder itself has changed over time. Once upon a time, domestic homicide was a greater percentage of the nation's murders, that boyfriends, husbands would dispatch the women in their lives, that in some cases women would, as a result of depression or other kinds of mental illness, cause harm to their children. These things happen. They've always happened. And over time, the courts and the police have become more proactive in intervening. In many jurisdictions, it's the very first time a husband is found to have beaten his significant other, that man is in serious trouble and is going to be spending quality time in front of a judge. That's a good thing. Anyway, domestic violence as a source of murder has declined. What that leaves are the harder kinds of murders to solve, the drug gang type murders, the murders between strangers. Those are, by definition, more difficult to solve. But the broader reason for why homicide clearances have dropped from 90% in the 60s to 61% last year, the broader reason for that is a failure to provide resources by increasingly financially strapped governments. Local government, cities and counties often cannot afford their pension funds. So how can they afford a properly resourced police department? It just is a fact. There are ever increasing demands for a very limited pie of resources in local government. And that effect has starved law enforcement. Unfortunately, we're seeing a failure to provide resources. When politicians make solving murder a priority, when they campaign on it, as has happened, magic ensues because the reputation of the politician is now on the line. And so he makes sure that police know that they're being monitored for how often they clear major crimes. If necessary, adjustments will be made in dollars assigned to law enforcement. When politicians make clearing crime a priority, usually the clearance rate improves. And that's what we're hoping becomes more of a trend.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And by the way, I get where you're going. And my point is not to just beat up on the FBI or the Department of Justice. But you make a really good point with this information, which is very valuable. And we're really super excited about the Murder Accountability Project. We've referenced your research on the podcast before and recommended it. And obviously, we're very excited to have you as a guest today to talk about these things. You're right. Actually, this information could arm citizens, and I don't mean with firearms, but with information that would be valuable to that conversation. As you're highlighting, if we don't put resources back into our law enforcement agencies, specifically cold case squads and more investigators, more homicide investigators, more forensic testing capability, the closure rate, this horrible decline that we've seen, I would imagine it'll just get worse, dipping below 60%.
Yeah, in fact, we think 2020 is going to be a horrible year. It'll be almost a year before we start to see the data. But I mean, let's face it, there was an awful lot of unrest last year, and police spent a lot of time dodging bricks. it's a little difficult under those circumstances to be solving murders.
It is. And then we talk to a lot of families of murder victims, as well as investigators, experts like yourself, and so on. And a lot of law enforcement agencies have been terribly impacted by COVID, and they're limited by their ability to go out and do casework because of restrictions, and then people with information aren't necessarily willing to interact with law enforcement for fear of the pandemic as well as everything else. So the officers are exposed and they are trying to be careful themselves, and you've got officers out sick. And as you said, it's been a tremendously unsettled and angry year this past year. Hopefully things will get better, but we've got a significant corner to turn as a country.
We can prove that it is literally a matter of life and death whether or not homicides get solved. That is to say that the advantage of carefully counting things allows us to make the statement I'm about to make. There is an inverse relationship between the rate at which homicides are cleared and the rate at which homicides occur. In a city where most homicides go unsolved, and that's a growing number of cities. Last year, there were 73 major police departments where most murders went unsolved.
That is more.
In those places, the rate of murder is well above the national average. And I can tell you that 50% is a kind of tipping point. It gets much worse. When you clear murders, when you make improvements in your murder clearance rate, the murder rate declines. You get a bonus. You get a murder bonus by getting the killers off the street. Good things happen. You get fewer murders. You get to save some of your resources. You know, it's a win-win. It's a virtual circle instead of what we have now, which is a vicious circle. That as murder clearances decline, the murder occurrence rate gets worse, which leads to more unsolved murders, and it becomes a vicious circle.
Right. It's this downward spiral, unfortunately, for law enforcement, the citizens of that city or town.
Can you go ahead and give us the number that I think everybody is really curious about? What is your estimate of how many cold case homicides there are in the United States?
Since 1980, there are at least 250,000.
Okay.
Wow.
It is as if America fought a major war and lost. I mean, it is a terrible thing.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Mind Over Murder.
A few years ago, I had lunch with the senior homicide supervisor for the nation of Denmark. And I asked him, how many murders a year do you have in Denmark? And he said about 50. And I said, what? That's a slow weekend in many of our cities.
Yes.
Yeah, he said about 50. And so I followed on, how many do you clear through arrest? And he said about 49.
Wow.
I know because all of the cases come across my desk. And if there's a case that hasn't been solved after a few weeks, I'll call and ask, what do you need? What's it going to take to clear this case? Mm-hmm. And he struck me as a really bright guy. I'd hate to be a killer and to know that this guy eventually was going to come after me. I mean, just a really bright guy.
And he's looking to solve 50 out of 50 homicides.
Yeah, that's
in
his goal,
an entire country.
Solving 49 out of 50 is a 98% clearance rate, which is a miracle. Yeah, and that's Denmark has a murder bonus by clearing so many cases. Hardly ever does a killer walk, and good things happen when you have that level of law enforcement performance.
So what are they doing correctly that we are not doing? I think that's probably the $25,000 question here. What do we need to be doing that Denmark currently is?
Yeah, I don't want to get involved in a discussion of guns, although guns are difficult to procure in Denmark. The reason I don't is it sucks all the atmosphere out of the room.
Sure.
What else is Denmark doing wisely? They certainly do take major crime very seriously, and they are looking to be proactive. They're looking to change when a young man starts to show violent tendencies. They're trying to develop policies that will wisely interdict that development. They make a serious effort to avoid imprisoning young men because all that does is to teach them how to be a really good criminal.
Right.
Prisons are a school of crime, and they know that. So they seek instead to put these young men on a different path. And I have to say, given the national data for Denmark and other European nations, that technique works. Trying to make changes rather than just incarcerating young people is probably a wise policy. And I think we in the United States are rethinking our incarceration rates big time. We certainly are rethinking our incarceration policies for nonviolent drug offenses.
Right.
We have the highest incarceration rate in the Western world, and I don't think it has served us well.
No, it's certainly not cutting down the number of unsolved homicides, that's for certain.
No.
I know people will say to us, well, we're not Denmark, we're not, some peaceful European country, which is true. But I think it's very important to steer back to just a moment ago, Thomas, you said our clearance rate back when I was a kid was over 90% here in the United States. And I'm not that old. The point is, we've allowed our ability to address the problem of violence and violent crime here in the United States to decline precipitously. So it isn't like we can say, well, things are much better in Tahiti. And I'm picking an absurd example here. Tahiti always struck me as a very peaceful place. And I used to live in Hawaii when I was a kid. My point is that right here in the United States, with perhaps a slightly smaller population, but nonetheless, we were clearing 90+% of homicides, and now we're dipping below 60%. It's pretty pathetic. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Yeah, and to your question, what could we be doing differently? There's something else that we don't do very much of in America, and that's to have layers of review and support. Law enforcement is primarily, overwhelmingly, a local matter. If a local police department fails to solve a murder, that's it. That's the end of it. It's up to that department to consider maybe creating a cold case squad or to take some other measure unto itself. Remember the Denmark case. There was a national homicide supervisor who oversaw every murder in his nation and would review individual cases. We don't have that in the United States. The state governments generally do not review cases. Certainly the federal government does not. Murder is not a federal crime. Murder without special circumstances is not a federal crime. And that's unfortunate, to have every police agency an island unto itself without support, without review, without supervision. We get what we get. And what we get in America is a increasingly lower clearance rate for all major crimes, but especially for homicide.
And there are 17,000 different law enforcement agencies in the country, as we understand it, with little or no coordination. And what you're saying is, except at the local level, little or no oversight as well.
Essentially, yes. I mean, that is how governance was designed, by going back to the founding of the nation, that each city is a sovereign entity, a sovereign government with its own rights and jurisdiction. Each state is sovereign. We forget that federal government means federation. It means a degree of different levels of government, not one unified central government. We've come to misunderstand what the word federal means. And that's the way this country was founded. I think that's the way most people would like it to be. But it's an unfortunate trend for law enforcement, because in many places, law enforcement is overwhelmed. In major cities where the clearance rate is low and the crime rate is very high, they would probably appreciate having more resources provided from outside the city. It's similar to the argument over how unfair it is how we fund public education, that in many places that have a low tax base, the public schools are not as good as they should be, and that's unfair. Well, the same argument can be made for law enforcement, that in places where the financial pie is challenged, and that's just about every city, it is unfortunate that their resources only are funded by local revenue and don't really get additional resources that would be helpful. They get some. There are assistance to law enforcement grants from the federal government, wholly inadequate to the need. So, this is basically a resource issue, and it's how we have created our government.
We've said about the Colonial Parkway murders, but I think this applies to this entire conversation. Cases like ours can be solved with time, attention, and resources. And all of those things cost money. And it appears like we're sort of, as a country, kind of cheaping out here in terms of not putting money where it would count, helping police do their job.
Yes. And we don't want our taxes to be very high. Americans generally don't want to support increasing their own burden. And, there isn't a whole clamor for providing increased resources to governments that need them by increasing taxation. It's just the way life is. So in the end, we have only ourselves to blame.
I feel like we're falling back on things that border on cliche, but I guess we get what we pay for here, don't we? We're not paying for a first-class, fully staffed law enforcement team, and therefore we're going to have problems with violent crime going unsolved because those officers who are currently assigned to solving those crimes are completely overwhelmed by just volume of one crime after another. As you said, 50 homicides could be a weekend's worth in some major cities. Chicago, I know, has taken a lot of static in the last couple of years for a horrible, horrible murder rate.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's true. We have not provided the necessary resources. We get what we get. It doesn't have to be this way. If we were to create national standards for law enforcement, that would be a good thing. If we would create a staffing that is based upon the crime problem that police face, that would also be a good thing. Not to allow in Cincinnati, Ohio, for years, they've had 13, 14 homicide investigators for a city that experiences over 100 murders a year, usually like 130 murders a year. Everybody who knows anything about crime would tell you that's inadequate, that you cannot be expecting cops to handle 10, 12, 15 murders a year. It's just impossible. They cannot do a proper job of it. We must change that math, that we should allow staffing to meet the demand of crime.
What would be the right size? Let's just stick with Cincinnati for a second. So it sounds like their crime rate has escalated. They have remained with the 13 officers or so in the homicide squad or whatever, however they refer to it. What do you think would be a more appropriate ratio? Here we are with 10 or 15 homicides per officer, and we all know from personal experience, sadly, how time-consuming a homicide investigation can be. What would be a right size in your estimation?
I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's not Cincinnati, it's Cleveland that has 13 homicide detectives. I've heard it quite often said by supervisors who are wise in these matters that it is inappropriate to expect a homicide investigator to handle more than 5 murders a year. That is, if you expect that case to go from initial investigation to a guilty verdict in a court of law.
Right.
It is just not possible for a homicide detective to handle more than 5. And you can then do the math. You go back to our website, you see how many murders occur in a particular city, and you take that total number, divide by 5, and then you'll say, well, then you need at least 20 or 25 homicide detectives if you're Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And you go and ask how many are there, and you're not going to get that number very often. Usually you're getting a much, much smaller number. I mean, we get what we get. We get the law enforcement that we pay for, and that's unfortunate.
Give us a little inside baseball here about how you gather your data, what you do when you have it. How many people are on your staff? How many of you are doing this full time? Give us a little insight into how your operation runs here.
First of all, we're all volunteers. Nobody gets paid. Therefore, we don't have full-time employees. Fortunately, we're dealing with computer data, and so we write our own algorithms to input data, and it becomes easier and easier. Often when we get a state to provide us data that they're not providing to the federal government, we write an algorithm to load their data, which will be in a different format. You do that one time, and then it gets easier the next time. So automation helps us mightily. It's primarily a simple computing problem. To actually handle the data, getting the data is a much more difficult process, and sometimes involves lawyers. We spend about 80% of our time handling the requests for data. We currently are involved in a lawsuit against the federal government. And so if Bill was saying I was too kind to the Justice Department, then I think he'll be much happier with what I'm about to say. 2 years ago, a friend of mine who works in the Interior Department came and asked that his boss was asking for information about Native American murders on Indian reservations. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing I told him was, well, I can tell you one thing, that's half of all Indian murders go unreported. And he said, what? And the next thing I know, I and my vice chairman are sitting across the table from Tara Sweeney, who was the Assistant Interior Secretary for Indian Affairs, talking loud and long about how half of all Indian murders are not being reported and why was that? And we weren't sure at the time. Secretary Sweeney asked us to make that fact known. And so we're nothing if not a tool of the Interior Department. So we published a report that indicated that half of all Indian murders go unreported. The reason we know that is we can count Indian murders in the supplemental homicide report put out by the FBI and compare that to the number of Indian murders reported to the CDC in Atlanta. And we find an alarming disconnect that a great many murders go unreported to the FBI. And we put that information out. We said there are over 2,400 Indian murders that were never reported going back to 2000. And darned if the next week the phone doesn't ring and it's reporters from Wyoming who are saying, yeah, now that you mention it, we can see cases that were not reported. We can look into your case files and we see very, very famous cases of the unsolved murders of Indian women in our counties went unreported. And I asked, well, so who investigated those? And in all cases, the answer was it was the FBI.
Oh. And so the FBI is not reporting their own investigations?
Yeah. So that's when the tumblers all fell into place. Remember earlier I said murder is not a federal crime? Well, it's not. But murder under special circumstances is. So if an Indian is killed on a reservation and the reservation is contracted for the primary major crime investigations to be conducted by the FBI, then it's an FBI case. If someone is murdered on federal land, such as a national park, that's also the FBI. It turns out that the FBI does a great many murder investigations every year. They have reported 0 murders. There are a great many murders that occur on military installations and are investigated by military police. NCIS is a very popular show.
Right.
Well, the NCIS and the Army and the Air Force, they've never reported murder, any of their murders, to the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. Crazily, there has been 0 reporting by the federal government of major crimes, even though Congress passed a law in 1988 requiring such reporting. It's the Uniform Federal Crime Reporting Act of 1988, which took effect on January 1st, 1989, that requires federal agencies to report major crimes that they investigate. That is probably the most ignored law in history, although there probably have been others, but we can document that there was 0 compliance with that law. So over the last 31 years, nobody was reporting major crimes, even though they're required by law to do so.
This is blowing my mind.
I know. This is actually shocking.
Oh my God.
The FBI isn't even adhering, and other federal agencies are not adhering to the law that requires them to simply report these homicides and homicide investigations?
Correct. It probably was the result. We can only guess. In fact, I'm hoping our judge will at some point ask the federal government, why didn't you? But we can only guess. It's possible that the FBI supervisors were of the opinion, well, that doesn't apply to us because after all, murder is not a federal crime.
That's not true, though. We're living this with the Colonial Parkway murders, which happened in a national park, at least some of them. And the FBI was the agency of jurisdiction from the very first day. So that statement on its face is completely untrue.
Yes. Well, we can prove that the FBI has never reported a murder, and the Department of Defense has never reported a murder, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs has never reported a murder.
And there are thousands and thousands of murders between those, just that handful of agencies you've mentioned.
Correct. So we're trying to change that. We filed under the Freedom of Information Act and under the Uniform Federal Crime Reporting Act of 1988, a request that the federal government shall report to us 31 years worth of unreported crimes.
Oh, I'd like to see that report when it comes out. I think I know some of the people that were murdered, by the way.
I'm sorry.
I am too, but I'm so pleased that it's taken the Murder Accountability Project to be willing to take on these powerful interests who are completely failing us as citizens. They're not even reporting. I'm not even, I could go on a rant about the fact that they're not solving these cases, but they're not even reporting them, which federal law requires them to do.
Yeah.
So what's your timing on this very important lawsuit?
So we've finished most of our arguments. It's been going back and forth. Yeah, at the very outset, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia told us they were not going to fight, that they were simply going to start negotiating for production of data. And then somewhere along the line, they decided, well, by golly, we will fight. We'll challenge whether or not we exhausted our remedies by making appeals, bureaucratic appeals, and they're going to challenge anything else they can think of.
Pardon me while I roll my eyes.
Well, so we're pretty confident we'll win. It's up to Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who's a pretty well-known federal jurist.
Yes, she's handled some pretty high-profile cases.
Yes, she has, and has shown good courage in all of them. I'm pretty confident that we'll win, but you never know until you actually win. I don't think there's any argument that the federal government has been in violation of federal law by not reporting data. So it's hard to imagine that we won't at some point win. And so we'll see. We are expecting a ruling or at least a hearing at some point. But hundreds and hundreds of pages of arguments have already gone back and forth in this. It's turning into a rather complex case. It should be noted that no one has ever obtained direct data from the FBI's Sentinel computer system. It's called Sentinel. It's the case management system.
Right.
And I guess I could understand the FBI probably does not appreciate being told that they have to produce data from their very secure and very sensitive internal data systems. And, they're not wrong. They need to keep that stuff secret. I mean, I understand that. But at the same time, the FBI and all of the other federal agencies must abide by the law, the reporting requirement. And it only makes sense. In the case of the Indian murders, the reason why the Interior Department was so interested to begin with is there is a growing narrative that there are too many murders and missing persons among indigenous girls and women, Indian girls and women. That's a very growing concern in what's called Indian country. Too many of our women are being killed or abducted. Whether that's true or not, we don't know because we don't have the data to check that. When we do get data from the FBI, we may know right away whether there's reason to think there might be serial murders occurring on some of the reservations. But right now, we don't know.
Do you even want to hazard a guess as to how many murders you would be looking at after 31 years of unreported data from the FBI and the Interior Department? Or is that a little bit too early to speculate?
No, not that many, because there aren't that many murders under special circumstances. Probably 100 or so under the Department of Defense per year. Probably in the neighborhood of 100 handled by the FBI. That's just a pure guess. That guess is based on our calculation of how many missing murders went unreported.
Right.
And so we're making a guess. The FBI has never reported how many homicides they investigate a year. They will at some point have to be doing that, but they haven't to date.
Join us again next time as we continue our conversation with Thomas Hargrove of the Murder Accountability Project. Thanks for listening to Mind Over Murder.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.